No one expected discomfort that night. Not at an awards ceremony built around legacy, reverence, and carefully chosen words. And definitely not from the youngest person on the stage. So let me start with a question that's been quietly circling ever since. How do you embarrass someone without insulting them? Without raising your voice? Without even naming them directly? But before we continue, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because that's what made this moment so unsettling. On the surface, the 2026 MLK Junior Beloved Community Awards unfolded exactly as planned. Polished speeches, standing ovations, a room full of people who knew how to clap at the right moments and stay silent at the right ones. The kind of night where nothing is supposed to go off script. And for most of the evening, nothing did. Until it did. When Billie Eilish stepped up to speak, expectations were modest. Thoughtful, maybe. Brief. Respectful. That's usually the role she's given in these rooms. A generational voice. A symbolic bridge. Someone young enough to represent the future, but careful enough not to disrupt the present. What no one anticipated was how carefully she would choose her words, or how much weight she'd allow them to carry without spelling anything out. And here's where things get uncomfortable, because sitting just a few seats away was Meghan Markle, introduced, applauded, framed as a moral authority for the evening. A figure positioned not just as a guest, but as a symbol, someone whose presence was meant to reinforce the values the ceremony claimed to honor. That contrast mattered, more than anyone realized at the time. This wasn't about celebrity drama. It wasn't even about rivalry. It was about something subtler. About authenticity. About who gets to speak and why. About the growing tension between lived conviction and curated identity. And maybe that's why the room reacted the way it did. Because when Billie spoke about purpose, about voices that don't need to announce themselves, about people who don't have to arrive, already wrapped in symbolism, something shifted. You could feel it. Applause came a half-second late. Heads turned, just slightly. Not enough to be obvious. Enough to be noticed. Did you catch that pause? Most viewers didn't at first. Social media would later latch onto a single word. A phrase. The suggestion of wannabe. But that wasn't the moment. The real moment came earlier. In the restraint. In what wasn't said. In how carefully Billie refused to look in anyone's direction. And that's what made it land. Because humiliation doesn't always sound like an insult. Sometimes it sounds like recognition. Sometimes it sounds like the room realizing something all at once and not knowing how to react. By the time Billie stepped away from the podium, nothing had exploded. No gasps. No audible backlash. No dramatic confrontation. Just polite applause. Professional smiles. Cameras cutting exactly when they were supposed to. Which should tell you something. Because what happened next didn't unfold on stage. It unfolded in glances, in silences, in who rushed forward, and who didn't. And that's where this story really begins. Why didn't anyone rush forward? That's the detail people keep skipping over. Not the applause. Not the headlines that followed. The movement in the room. Or more accurately, the lack of it. At events like this, there's a choreography everyone understands. When a speech lands well, senior figures lean in. A hand on the shoulder. A whispered, beautifully said. When something goes wrong, there's usually damage control. Staffers appear. Allies reposition. The energy shifts toward containment. But after Billie stepped away from the podium, something strange happened. Nothing. People stood. They clapped. They smiled. And then they stayed exactly where they were. No immediate circle formed. No reassuring huddle. No visible effort to reframe the moment. Cameras lingered just long enough to catch that beat of stillness before cutting wide. And that silence mattered more than the words. Because sitting there, just a few feet away, Meghan didn't move either. She didn't stand early. She didn't look toward Billie. She didn't lean into the applause. Her expression wasn't angry. It wasn't shocked. It was measured. Controlled. The kind of stillness you learn when you've spent years knowing cameras are always watching. That's not an accusation. It's an observation. And it raises a question. What do you do when a moment isn't loud enough to protest, but sharp enough to feel personal? Billie's speech hadn't attacked anyone. In fact, if you isolate the transcript, it reads almost gentle, carefully inclusive, full of language about service, humility, and voices that grow quietly rather than announce themselves. On paper, it was safe, uncontroversial, but context changes everything. Because context placed those words in a room where symbolism had already been assigned, where Meghan's presence wasn't neutral, it was framed, introduced, elevated. The ceremony had done that work before Billie ever spoke, which means Billie didn't need to name anyone. She just needed to describe the opposite. And people noticed. You could see it in the way some heads nodded slowly, almost reluctantly. In the way others avoided eye contact altogether. A few attendees later described the moment as unexpectedly tense, though none could quite explain why. That's usually how it goes. When something hits too close to truth, language gets slippery. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been in a room where everyone suddenly realizes the same thing, but no one wants to be the first to say it out loud? That's what this felt like. Because this wasn't about age or fame. It wasn't even about activism. It was about credibility. About whether meaning is something you build or something you borrow, and whether the audience can tell the difference. What made it sharper was Billie's refusal to linger. She didn't circle the idea, didn't underline it. She moved on, as if to say, this doesn't need emphasis. If it lands, it lands. And it did. But here's the part that complicates everything. Billie didn't benefit from this moment. Not publicly. Not immediately. There was no grin. No wink. No backstage quote. She didn't capitalize on it at all. Which suggests this wasn't calculated provocation. At least not in the way critics might assume. So why say it? Why choose that framing, in that room, on that night? Because sometimes the most disruptive thing you can do isn't to confront power, but to redefine what it looks like. And that kind of disruption doesn't cause explosions. It causes discomfort. Lingering discomfort. The kind people carry with them as they leave the room. And they did. As the ceremony moved on, the energy never fully recovered. Conversations afterward were quieter. Fragmented. People spoke in half sentences. As if everyone was trying to figure out whether they'd witnessed a subtle rebuke or something much larger. But the real shift didn't happen there. It happened later. Away from the stage. Away from the cameras. And once you see what unfolded behind the scenes, that pause after the applause starts to look less accidental and more like a warning. So here's the question people started asking quietly, not that night, but the morning after. How do you respond to something that never quite happened? Because by then, the clips were circulating. Short ones. Cropped ones. The kind that strip away atmosphere and leave just enough to provoke debate without explaining why. Commentators argued over tone. Over intention. Over whether anyone was reaching. And on the surface, it looked like nothing more than interpretation. But backstage, it didn't feel like interpretation at all. According to multiple attendees, the energy shifted the moment Billie left the stage. Not dramatically. Not visibly. It was more like gravity changing. Conversations stalled. Schedules tightened. People who'd planned to mingle didn't. The room thinned faster than expected. And here's the part that doesn't get talked about much. There was no immediate effort to reclaim the narrative. No press release clarifying intent. No friendly quote smoothing over meaning. No anonymous source rushing to reassure anyone that nothing was meant by it. For an event so carefully managed, that absence was striking. Silence can be strategic, but it can also be revealing. Meghan's team, usually quick to frame moments before they harden into consensus, stayed quiet. Not defiant. Not conciliatory. Just absent. And that vacuum allowed something else to form. Interpretation. People began replaying the speech in full. Not the clipped versions. The pauses. The pacing. The way Billie spoke about purpose without once invoking struggle as branding. The way she talked about service without centering herself in it. And inevitably, comparisons emerged. Not because Billie made them. Because the room already had. Here's where the word wannabe becomes complicated. Because when people heard it, or thought they heard it, they weren't reacting to insult. They were reacting to implication. To the idea that some identities are assumed, while others are performed. That's a dangerous line to draw in public. Especially in a space meant to honor moral leadership. And maybe that's why the reaction fractured the way it did. Younger viewers online largely understood the moment instinctively. They described it as clean, subtle, brutal without being cruel. Older commentators struggled. They asked for explicit evidence. A smoking gun. A sentence that could be isolated and condemned. But there wasn't one. And that's the problem. Because if humiliation doesn't announce itself, can you even defend against it? Behind the scenes, The tension reportedly peaked not during Billie's speech, but afterward, when a few invited guests declined a planned private reception appearance. No statements, no explanations, just sudden scheduling conflicts, one by one. Was that coincidence? Possibly, but patterns don't need intent to be meaningful. And then there was Billie herself. No follow-up, no interviews expanding on her words, no clarification posts. She didn't lean in the way public figures often do when controversy offers oxygen. If anything, she retreated, as if the point had already been made, and further explanation would only dilute it. That restraint made people more uncomfortable, not less, because it suggested confidence. The kind that doesn't need validation. So ask yourself this. If this had truly been a misunderstanding, if the room had misheard, misread, overreacted, would the response have looked like this? Or would someone, somewhere, have rushed to say, "You're reading too much into it"? No one did. And that silence gave the moment time to harden into something else. Not scandal, not outrage, recognition. But the most telling development hadn't surfaced yet. It wasn't public. It wasn't online. It was a conversation that happened hours later, behind closed doors, involving people who rarely miscalculate moments like this. And once that conversation comes into view, the meaning of that single word, and that single pause, starts to look very different. Why did no one rush to defend her? That question lingered longer than the headlines, longer than the clips, longer than the debates that burned hot for a day and then cooled into something quieter, more uncomfortable. Because by the time the private conversations started surfacing, it became clear this wasn't about a misunderstood phrase or an overly sensitive audience. It was about alignment, about whether the room felt, in that moment, that the symbolism still matched the substance. According to two sources familiar with the post-event discussions, there was a brief but tense exchange later that night among organizers and senior attendees. Not an argument, no raised voices, just a recalibration. A recognition that something had shifted, and not in a way that could be undone with a quote or a clarification. One person described it as the air going out of the balloon. Another used a different phrase. We realized the moment had passed. That's a hard thing for institutions to admit, especially ones built on legacy. What's striking is that the discomfort didn't come from Billie's words themselves. It came from how easily they settled into place, as if they'd been waiting there, as if the room had been primed for them. Think about that for a second. If a comment lands too cleanly, too naturally, it's usually because it's completing a thought people were already carrying. That's why the absence of outrage matters. No one stormed out. No one demanded apologies. There was no dramatic walk back. Instead, there was distance. Subtle, polite, unmistakable distance. Invitations quietly cooled. Future collaborations became under discussion. Language softened. Presence diminished. None of that shows up in a viral clip, but it shows up in patterns. And it reframes the meaning of wannabe entirely. Because in this context, it wasn't an insult. It was a diagnosis. A recognition that in 2026, audiences are less impressed by proximity to power and more attentive to coherence. They want the story and the speaker to match. And when they don't, the gap becomes visible, sometimes painfully so. Here's the uncomfortable part. This moment didn't elevate Billie. She didn't gain anything tangible from it. She didn't become louder. She didn't take a victory lap. If anything, she disappeared from the conversation entirely, letting others argue around the silence she left behind. That's not how performative confrontation works, which suggests this wasn't about her at all. It was about the room realizing it had outgrown a narrative it kept repeating out of habit. And Meghan, to her credit or detriment depending on how you see it, didn't explode. She didn't lash out. She didn't force a confrontation that might have reframed her as a victim. She stayed still, strategic, watching. But stillness only works when the ground beneath you isn't shifting. By the end of the week, the awards ceremony had moved on. The official story was unity, inspiration, success. Yet privately, several insiders acknowledged something had cracked. Not broken, cracked. A hairline fracture in how credibility is assigned on stages like this. And fractures don't heal by pretending they aren't there. So here's the question that matters now. If a single sentence, spoken quietly, can unsettle a room built on symbolism, what does that say about the symbolism itself? Because that's the question no one wanted to answer that night. And it's the one that lingers still. But there's one more layer to this. One final shift that happened after the cameras, after the conversations, after the silence had settled. And once you see that, the moment on stage stops looking accidental altogether. So let's go back to where we started. To that quiet question. The one that didn't sound dangerous at first. How do you embarrass someone without insulting them? Because now, with distance, with context, with the aftermath fully visible, the answer feels clearer and more unsettling. You don't do it by attacking. You don't do it by shouting. You do it